Okay,
I'm not doing this podcast anymore.
Don't be stupid. It's just
Really?
a degree. Degree
Well
to
done.
degree. Hai,
Where did you
whatever.
do this from?
Huh?
At the Azam?
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Shukran.
Oh, my third intro. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Systematic. Today I am joined by Dr. Amina Khan, who is Director of CAMEA at the Institute of Strategic Studies Islamabad. We are going to be asking her about everything related to Afghanistan, the region, and what do we expect coming forward. So, Amina, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, let me congratulate you on your PhD. I hear that you've just recently completed it. Newly minted doctor.
Well, I'm still waiting for the degree to officially come, but yeah, thank
Well,
you.
congratulations. Anyhow, so I wanted to ask you, before we move ahead, a lot of our viewers, I think, and me included, are stuck in this, almost fog of war, if you will, with regards to Afghanistan. We don't really know what's happening. There's a bunch of information that is coming from certain channels, which we don't know whether to trust or not. So could you explain to us, from a governance perspective in Afghanistan and from a political perspective in Afghanistan, what really is the situation today in the country?
Well, it's interesting. Let's go back to, say, August 2021. I think when the Afghan Taliban, I often like to refer to them as the dispensation. When they came back into power, I think there was a lot of ambiguity as to what the Taliban's return means, not only domestically, but I think regionally as well. And over the past 3 years, I think I've come to this vague conclusion that I think they are, of course, authoritarian, but selectively pragmatic. Now, a lot of people question, well, how are they pragmatic, and where has the pragmatism been? In terms of the economy, in terms of the fact that, the country is now by and large under one rule.
Yeah.
Yes, the argument is that, well, they were the insurgents here, now they're the government, so hence the insurgents, the violence has reduced. But I think there is overall stability. And we see this, and this has been, mentioned in various reports as well. Moreover, the fact that they've been able to generate an economy, good or bad, but they are able to a large extent.
In some very challenging circumstances.
Exactly, and the fact that they don't have the expertise, but they've clamped down on corruption. They've been focusing on trade, on revenue, on customs, and I think and the fact that they are trading within the region. And they've really been focusing on domestic infrastructure and trying to get as much investment, particularly from the region. So this is where the pragmatism is. Another thing is, we talk about inclusivity. Now,
which I think has been the biggest, issue when it comes to Afghanistan. We keep on hearing, the women have been excluded from all sectors.
Well, yeah, so that's human and women's rights. But I'm talking about inclusivity, when they say that you should involve or incorporate other ethnic factions.
I see.
Now, this might not sound particularly big, but the fact is that they have 9 non-Pashtuns in their current administration. And I think
in the cabinet.
In the cabinet. And I think this is huge because, again, the mistake we often make is we compare the Afghan Taliban of today to the days of the Republic. And I think that's the mistake. You should compare the Afghan Taliban today to their previous rule, where you could never even think of, having a non-Pashtun in the cabinet.
Yeah.
So even though they're token figures, but the fact that they have 9 Pashtuns, I think this is something that at least should be recognized. Now, yes, women's rights is a major issue. But again, here the contradiction comes. While they're not allowing girls above 6th grade to go to school, at the same time, they've opened economic centers specifically for, women in Herat, in Kabul. They have this huge conference. It's an economic conference called the Imam Abu Hanifa Exhibition Conference. Their terms are a little funny, but where you have more than 300 women entrepreneurs.
Wow.
They've opened shelter homes for women. So, there's a contradiction.
Yeah.
And the fact that you do have prominent members of the Afghan Taliban openly supporting women's rights and women's rights to education. So you see, this is the change, and I think this is what gives me cautious optimism. The fact that the Afghan Taliban prominent members like Stanakzai, like Baradar, like Mullah Yaqub, and the Haqqanis are speaking out against the policies of the Emir, which is something you could never have imagined, say, 20 years ago. So this is where I think, the pragmatism comes in, but then the authoritarian policies again are their continuous curb on journalists, on women's rights, the fact that they still don't have a constitution. And it's interesting because they're still governing under those ministries that were formed by the previous administration. So, it's complex, it's fragile, but the fact is that the country hasn't collapsed. It hasn't been a major issue for regional countries apart from when it comes to counterterrorism, right? And particularly Pakistan. But otherwise, I think the kind of fallback many regional countries were anticipating certainly didn't happen. And I think the region is so fragile, it couldn't take the fallout of Kabul, say,
absolutely.
20 years ago.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, that's very interesting. I don't think we really get that conception of some level of, some semblance of stability coming into Afghanistan when we're sitting across the border here. But that's one, it's good to know, right? Secondly, that gives hope for stability here on this side of the border, I think. And moving towards that, we've seen a number of high-profile events recently, right? The assassination of the Ghanis, high-profile assassination there in Afghanistan. We've had the suicide bombing in Kora Khatak. We have also seen, border clashes now taking place between Pakistan and Afghan, fighters. Where do you think? Well, first of all, could you explain this, locate this to us in the entire relationship? Like, what do these, particular events mean, and where do you think this is going to go now?
Look, I've always said that the Afghan-Pakistan bilateral relationship is extremely complex and fragile. And I think it's nice to use terms like conjoined twins and brothers, but I think we really need to be pragmatic and accept each other as two sovereign and independent nations.
I just want to stop you there. Conjoined twins have a lot of logistical difficulties, right? So
and we see them.
We see them,
you
right?
See? And this is my point, that if you look at the Pakistan-Afghanistan bilateral relationship, majority of the problems that we see today are in fact embedded in historical bilateral irritants. And there hasn't been, I think, a conscious effort on both sides to address those bilateral irritants. And hence, you see them propping up after every, say, at least a year or so. And we've seen this. If you look at the relationship now, it is no different than it was during the days of the Republic.
The same problems are,
the same, because they're inherent. The only difference is you have different actors now. You've got the Afghan Taliban. And again, I think it was naive of many individuals to think here in Pakistan that the Afghan Taliban have returned and Pakistan's problems will, just all of a sudden vanish, and that whatever Pakistan wants, it will achieve in Afghanistan. What is that exactly, number one? I think we need to ask ourselves. Number two, we need to understand that the Afghan Taliban are not pushovers like, I'm sorry to say, President Ghani or President Karzai. They're hardcore Pashtuns and they mean business. And do remember, they are the ones that have never accepted the legality of the border. And this is something that they always bring up. So I think, number one, there has to be a conscious effort on both sides to view each other as two separate and sovereign independent states. And at best, Oves, I think we should aim for workable ties. Because, no matter what you say or do, even after 4 decades, you ask any Afghan, unfortunately, whether he's a Pashtun or a if he's a Tajik or Uzbek or Hazara, they have nothing nice to say about Pakistan. And that's very sad, because I think Pakistan has been an exemplary host when it comes to refugees and whatnot. So clearly something has gone wrong in the bilateral relationship, number one. Number two, I think what we're seeing now with the border. Again, the problem is that we often view the relationship as, well, the Afghans are dependent on us. No, it's an interdependent relationship. And I say that because since the Afghan Taliban came into power, our transit trade, by the way, with Central Asia increased by 70%. So that shows you, while the bilateral trade has been in favor of, Kabul, although now it's gone down because of, for the past 2 years, because of the sporadic closure of the border, you've seen bilateral trade in favor of Afghanistan, but transit trade for Pakistan has increased. So you see the interdependence there.
Absolutely.
But the problem is that whenever there is an issue between both the countries, unilateral decisions are taken. Why? Because there's an absence of a bilateral framework both countries can go back to. For example, the Indians signed a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan. I think this was back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. It's still intact. The Iranians signed something similar. The terminologies are different. It's still intact. Pakistan and Afghanistan, again, two highly interdependent countries, have nothing to go back to. So whenever anything happens, for example, on the border, usually the border is closed. And what happens then, actions are taken on both sides that are obviously counterproductive. So I actually think, and this is something that I have been trying to propose, that pending formal recognition, both countries really should start focusing on some sort of a bilateral framework which covers all contours of the bilateral relationship,
And
whether
which
it's
is
security, whether it's trade, or whatnot.
Yeah, and it would have elements which are insulated from the ups and downs of day-to-day politics, right?
I mean,
so borders don't or trade does not have to necessarily stop
This is the
if
thing.
one party is upset.
This is the thing, because when something happens, now closing the border is not a solution, and actually it's detrimental to both sides, and we seem to think that it only affects the Afghan side. No, remember, if they send goods, there are traders on our side that are equally a part of the
Absolutely, ecosystem.
transnational trade network.
Yeah.
So it just bewilders me, and I think the sad part is that since the border keeps on closing, the Afghans, they're tradesmen, they are finding other avenues and other routes to trade.
Yeah.
So who's losing out?
We are.
We did try with the Afghanistan-Pakistan action plan for peace and solidarity, but it's such a mouthful that I don't think it was going to work in the first place. So really, I think both countries need to focus on something, I think, comprehensive.
Yeah.
And I've always said that, we've got so many examples, and I don't want to get into it, but if you create economic interdependence, believe me, it reduces the chances of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we really need to focus on this. And policies, again, I think both sides have taken, whether it's the Afghan Taliban's really callous attitude towards countering the TTP, or Pakistan's policies, particularly regarding refugees or the border, again, counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to discuss this. Going back to your point that, people who've had exposure, Afghans who've had exposure to Pakistan, really don't have much good to say, even if they've been here for decades. And is that because of the neglect, and I would say from both sides really, of the lived human experience that happens? Whether it's crossing the border, whether it's access to medical care in Pakistan, or whether it is people being attacked and losing their lives in this thing, and losing family members. I think that's something that's been ignored to quite an extent, and it's become a victim of much of the politics, but also much of it's almost become a bargaining tool, right? That we can play with lives,
yes.
And especially I think from our end, the refugee issue, right? Or the fact that Afghans in Islamabad were being expelled at such levels. So do you feel that this is something that we can target, whether it's through an agreement like this, but and really insulate at least the human suffering and take that out of the equation as much as possible?
I think the fact you've talked about refugees, and I think this is a sensitive issue, because I think Pakistanis, by and large, in our lives, we've always interacted with Afghans, and I think we've never considered them as the other.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, because of the tense bilateral relationship, I don't know whether you've noticed, but Pakistanis now view the Afghan as the other.
Yeah.
And I think that is so dangerous for a country like Pakistan that has a huge ethnic Pashtun population. And we have a very, fragile social, fabric. And again, this is very dangerous, what we've been playing with. It bewilders me. Pakistan, we're not a, law better than I do. We're not a signatory to Geneva Conventions, but we've hosted Afghan refugees, and I like to say for more than 4 decades. And I think we've done a pretty admirable job in doing so compared to other countries, and compared to now what we're seeing in the West, the way they're, treating refugees. But I think the past 3 years has undone the goodwill of those, 4 decades. And what has it achieved? Now, it might have worked, say, with President Ghani, because obviously he was totally dependent on Western aid, and so we could use the refugee card as leverage. With the Afghan Taliban, by the way, they've done a pretty good job in rehabilitating the refugees that have gone back, because if you speak to them, they say, well, we've lived like this for the past 20 years. It's their country. They should come and live like us. And at least they will live with dignity. And refugees have gone back. Of course, they're trickling back, but the fact is that it has not worked. And again, the goodwill that we created, amongst these Pashtuns who could have been potential diplomats for Pakistan, it's just gone.
It's been squandered,
and
I
it's
think,
really upsetting, and it's sad, because there are many people I know now in Islamabad that are hiding out of fear. Many of them are relocating to Peshawar because they feel more safe there. But this is not what Pakistan is. We're far better than this, and this really upsets me. And again, yes, the human aspect of this, we have completely, I think, just brushed under the carpet. It comes to even the cricket team. Initially the Afghan cricket team would talk about how they learned cricket here. Now they want no association, and that is sad. And again, it's dangerous for a country that has such a huge Pashtun ethnic community here.
Absolutely. And this is one of those intractable and complex issues that feels like it's its own goal after own goal, right? And I think from both sides, it's not just a Pakistan thing, though I think there has been a lot of arrogance in our approach at times. I think there's been a lot of callousness in how we've looked at a number of these issues, but also from the Afghanistan side, whether it was the previous government or this dispensation right now. It really hasn't. We haven't really taken into consideration the genuine concerns of each other.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And I think that is a different conversation that needs to start taking place.
Because also I think it's been very transactional. We always talk about the Pakistan-American relationship as being transactional. It's the same here.
Absolutely.
Because both countries haven't really invested. For example, climate change is an issue that is affecting both countries. We've seen it.
Absolutely.
Floods in Pakistan and whatnot, and then you've seen it in Afghanistan. You don't have a water sharing agreement with Afghanistan. So tomorrow, push comes to shove, and if this, we're seeing this negative trajectory following, what if the Taliban or, again, the dispensation or whoever is in Kabul, and again, I don't want to just pin it to the Taliban, anybody sitting in Kabul, what if they start using water as leverage or a tool? So again, I think
take a leaf from the Indian playbook.
Yeah, you can. And by the way, you just mentioned India. Look at how India has learned and how quickly it has changed its stance. To a country that completely opposed the Taliban. Now they've started more than 60% of their developmental projects that they had, stopped, temporarily halted when the takeover took place.
Well, that's really interesting, and also quite eye-opening for us as well. Needs to be.
And sorry, let me just say, because I don't want to be India-centric. India can do whatever it wants, but I think we need to build a bilateral relationship, regardless of whether they have a relationship with Afghanistan or not.
So I wanted to ask you, you've just come back from a visit to the US, and you did the think tank circuit, and you spoke to a number of thought leaders over there. I wanted to ask you, now with this new dispensation in the US, with Trump coming in, putting a torch to much of classic and foundational foreign policy principles of the US. How does Trump view this region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and generally, what do you think is going to be the US approach to what's going
Right
forward?
now, to be very honest with you, the number of interactions that I did have, Afghanistan does not figure anywhere. It is really not a priority.
It's last year's news, or it's
They say that he or the people that I spoke to that are going to be potentially his advisors. They say that we achieved in Afghanistan, we got a deal, good or bad, and for that I have to say that Trump, despite his other issues and drawbacks, I think he was the only one that was able to get a deal in Afghanistan, because I don't think Biden would have been able to.
That's true.
And that's another thing, whether the Afghan Taliban or say the international community has adhered to the Doha process, but the deal did achieve, I think it was huge, and that has been a positive development. But the point was that once you sign a deal, then you have to ensure that both sides fulfill those sides of the agreement. And to be very honest with you, the Doha agreement, there's much talk of going back to the Doha agreement, although I don't think the dispensation in Kabul is interested, because if you see the Doha agreement, it has by and large benefited the Afghan Taliban. Initially, it benefited the Americans because the Taliban stopped attacking international troops, primarily the Americans. But if you look at the intra-Afghan dialogue, if you look at the constitution,
the level of
women's
legitimacy
rights and whatnot,
it gave
exactly. So it's benefited them.
Absolutely.
But having said so, right now, as I said, it's not a priority. He's more fixated on, I think, domestic politics. You're seeing what happened with Ukraine, Gaza. Eventually, it might come up, but it will only come up if you have a strong and a united Afghan diaspora. That you don't have, number one. Number two, I think, as I said, Trump seems to think that, unless until there isn't a major security threat emanating from Afghanistan, the ISKP is there, but by and large, the Afghan Taliban have been able to deter them.
Okay.
So what's the reason for, Trump to revert his attention back to Afghanistan? I've heard that if push comes to shove in terms of a major security threat emanating from Afghanistan, primarily the ISKP. If you remember, he was very upset when the American troops left the Bagram Air Base. And he said that we should have a small contingent there. So again, this is just conspiracy theory, but I've heard this from Kabul and from some individuals in Washington that if the need arises, Trump could send a small contingent to Afghanistan under the garb of counterterrorism to support the dispensation in Afghanistan in fighting the ISKP. And that would also be a win-win for the Afghan Taliban, because they could say, well, we are now a government and they are coming to assist us in fighting a common enemy. But the problem here is if and when this happens, I don't think the region would very much accept this or promote this, particularly countries like Iran, because Iran is, next in line, as they say, in terms of
Iran and I think what was it Trump that I was saying, but it's basically saying that Bagram was a very important tool and gave us access to where China builds its nuclear weapons and stuff like that, right? Things like that. So I don't think anybody would be welcoming the return of
but
US.
with Trump, as I said, he makes deals and he does what he thinks is right, and he seems to think that he has that leverage with the Afghan Taliban. But then at the same time, he's saying that all the weapons, that were left behind, we want them back. Obviously, you see the statements coming from Zabiullah Mujahid. That's not going to happen. But right now, it's not a priority. I think, from what I understand, Washington thinks that Afghanistan now is a regional, problem, and that the region should take over, or the region should deal with it. It will only become an international problem, God forbid, if we see a major, terrorist strike. But again, this is the mistake I think, again, the international community makes, that Afghanistan is a country that has always had global ramifications. And we've seen the ISKP. It is, I think, a common ground where countries like Iran, Pakistan, the US, China, even Russia were on the same page. And we've seen the ISKP conduct attacks against all these countries minus the US. Not that I'm saying they should, but this is something that it's a common ground. And now that you're having fighters coming back from Syria, with the Zainabiyuns joining the Daesh, this transnational terrorist network, it is extremely, extremely detrimental for the region. And I don't think the region actually is doing enough to deal with this, because if you see this compartmentalized approach, the Afghan Taliban are keeping certain regional countries happy, catering to their concerns, whereas they're ignoring the others.
But I mean, even the region is so fractured right now, right? Does Pakistan want to sit with Iran with how how hot Iran is at the moment?
Well, surprisingly, Iran and Pakistan, they have, I think, after this is for the first time in the history of this region where regional countries are on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan, particularly Iran and Pakistan, in terms of the Again, it's Iran and Pakistan, we are the ones, both countries, that have the refugee problem, the ISKP problem, even bilateral irritants, but between Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan and Afghanistan are far more graver than the others.
And do you feel that this is manifesting into concrete proposals on the ground, or actual policy level changes in these countries or with Afghanistan? Is there some level of something happening?
Well, I was hopeful initially, when we've had these meetings. Still the SCO hasn't revived the contact group on Afghanistan. I was hoping they would, because Afghanistan, by the way, was I think an observer of the SCO, but obviously that status has been temporarily paralyzed. But the SCO contact group, I was hoping it would be revived, because it's all the countries that matter, all the countries that are affected. So far, nothing. We just get statements regarding Afghanistan. As I said, there is regional consensus on Afghanistan. And as you see, there is no recognition. Regional countries have decided that if and when it comes, it will be a regional and a collective response. But there is no coherent regional framework to engage with Kabul. And that's why you see this compartmentalized approach. For example, counterterrorism. Why is it that Kabul is only catering to, say, the needs of, say, China or Uzbekistan, but not Pakistan, not Iran, not Tajikistan? So I think there has to be a collective approach where one threat, if it's Pakistan's threat, it's a threat to the region. And it shouldn't be this compartmentalized approach. And I think this is what has, made the Taliban, I don't want to use arrogant, but overconfident, and particularly when President Xi, received the credentials of the Bilal, the Afghan ambassador, then this just, elevated their sense of, diplomacy. And by the way, they've learned the art of diplomacy. They know what matters. But here again, I will say, and this is not just because I'm a Pakistani, but I think they underestimate the importance of the bilateral relationship, because you can have a great relationship with the rest of the region, but if you don't have a good relationship with Pakistan, then how do you expect these transnational, rail roads, the one with with Uzbekistan, or CPEC, or even, these connectivity projects, how do they actually, progress when you don't have a good relationship with Pakistan, because they all come through Pakistan in one form or the other?
So my last question on this: how do we get the Afghan Taliban, from our perspective, from Pakistan's perspective, how do we get them to listen? That look, we have genuine security concerns. We have, we want to improve the relationship, but these are particular issues. Theirs is the refugee. I mean, a bunch of irritants. How do we get them to listen and make actual changes?
So I think it has to be a two-way approach, one bilateral. I think still there are individuals within the dispensation that realize Pakistan's importance and the relationship that we've had over the years, where they can deliver. But you see, the problem here is a loudspeaker diplomacy. I'm going to be critical first on our side. And nothing happens and it's already in our press, it's already in our media. That doesn't work. Negotiations, engagement, these are very fragile things and they take time, number one. Yes, it's the Afghan Taliban, when they deny that they don't have TTP in Afghanistan or they don't have leverage, we all know that's not true. Because they've offered negotiations, they've offered to relocate them, which shows that they have leverage and whatnot. But here I would just say that as much as we hate and despise the TTP, when we say, then let's make it clear. When we say Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, are we not then owning up to the fact that they're Pakistani? So if they're Pakistani, can we not give negotiations a chance? I know that they have committed atrocities and innocent blood has been wasted, but there has to be a middle path. And I still think that we have to give genuine negotiations a chance. And I think Pakistan can do that. But there has to be the will. And I'm not saying that you should consider the TTP as one group. No, there are many groups within and under the TTP. I'm sure there are many groups that are willing to reconcile with the state, because there is fatigue over there too. They have families too. So this is something we have to do. Number two, we need to hold Kabul accountable. But I think the way we're doing it is by closing the border or sending refugees back. That hasn't worked and it's not going to work. Bilaterally, we have to go back to the table. And thirdly, then we have to use the regional approach. Regional countries have to exert a certain amount of pressure on the Afghan Taliban. And I think we're seeing that now with the Chinese, because all the attacks, by the way, that have taken place on the Chinese in Pakistan have all been conducted by the TTP.
Wow.
So the TTP is not just a Pakistani problem.
Absolutely.
And, I think the Afghan Taliban are being naive. ISKP, if you go back to its history, when they came to Afghanistan in late 2014, early 2015, the 2-3 emirs initially of the ISKP were all ex-TTP.
Wow.
So the fact is that whether it's now maybe 6 months, 2 years, the TTP is going to become a major problem for the Afghan Taliban.
It's a
so I think
metastasizing.
They need to make a conscious decision, right? Do they want to have a relatively friendly neighborhood where there's regional connectivity, there's trade, or do they want to depend on a temporary terrorist ally, which will eventually go back to haunt them?
Bite the hand that feeds it.
Exactly. Because that's the nature of these transnational terrorist groups. And if you see now with the ISKP's ideology is completely different and contradictory to the Afghan Taliban. And you do know that the ISKP has killed at least 22, top and mid-level Taliban commanders.
Wow.
So this is a conscious decision they have to take. And honestly, look, the Afghan Taliban, they've been in power now for 3 years. They can't have, the best of both worlds. They have to decide. If they want to be a responsible member of the international community, they have to adhere to international, expectations. And one of them is counterterrorism, which, by the way, they themselves agreed to in the Doha Agreement.
Yeah.
And, they easily say, well, we signed it with the West. No. Pakistan was also a part of that process, and it actually begins in the region, at home first. Then it expands. So I think there has to be work done on both sides, but this current trajectory is extremely negative, and it's worrying for the region.
No, absolutely. I mean, just the news coming out of Torkham and the attacks on the borders, that's really very disappointing. But just on a personal note, I feel that there's, so much hope and so much potential in this relationship. Afghanistan, it's got a new start, a new lease on life. This past 3 years, it can really change things for the people of Afghanistan, but also for the people of Pakistan. Right? There is so much potential there, whether it's our access to Central Asia or whether it is Afghanistan itself as a an economic actor in the region. I just hope that we can get our issues resolved as soon as possible, and do this in a way which is beneficial, not just for the political dispensations in both countries, but also for the people on the ground, because we just can't have border stoppages and visas being denied and refugees being kicked out just like that without real understanding. So Amina, thank you again. Thank you for taking out the time. I think this was a really interesting discussion. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Please do like and subscribe. Follow us on all the social media channels, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.